Maverick News. The world is watching. In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Early this morning, the U.S. military struck another Houthi-controlled site in Yemen just one day after the U.S. and Great Britain launched multiple airstrikes targeting Houthi rebels. The first day of strikes, Friday, hit 28 locations and struck more than 60 targets. President Joe Biden had warned Friday that the Houthis could face further strikes in the days to come. The latest strike came after the U.S. Navy on Friday warned American-flagged vessels to steer clear of areas around Yemen in the Red Sea. The warning came as Yemen's Houthis vowed fierce retaliation, further raising the prospect of a wider conflict in a region already beset by Israel's war in Gaza. At a stop in Pennsylvania Friday, President Biden told reporters, quote, "We will make sure that we respond to the Houthis if they continue this outrageous behavior along with our allies." The White House said in November that it was considering redesignating the Houthis as a terrorist organization after they began their targeting of civilian vessels. The administration formally delisted the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization and specially designated global terrorists in 2021, undoing a move by President Donald Trump. Lieutenant General Douglas Sims, director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said Friday's airstrikes were largely in low-populated areas and the number of those killed would not be high. He said the strikes hit weapons, radar, and targeting sites, including in remote mountain areas. As the bombing lit the pre-dawn sky over multiple sites held by the Iranian-backed rebels, it forced the world to again focus on Yemen's long civil war, which began when the Houthis seized the country's capital. Since November, the rebels have repeatedly targeted ships in the Red Sea, saying they were avenging Israel's offensive in Gaza against Hamas, in solidarity with Palestine. But they have frequently targeted vessels with tenuous or no clear links to Israel, imperiling shipping in a key route for global trade and energy shipments. The Houthis' military spokesman said in a recorded message that the U.S. airstrikes would, quote, not go unanswered or unpunished. Though the Biden administration and its allies have tried to calm tensions in the Middle East for weeks and prevent any wider conflict, the latest round of strikes threatens to ignite one. Saudi Arabia, which supports the government in exile that the Houthis are fighting, quickly sought to distance itself from the attacks as it seeks to maintain a delicate détente with Iran and a ceasefire it has in Yemen. The Saudi-led, U.S.-backed war in Yemen has killed more than 150,000 people, including fighters and civilians, and created one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, killing tens of thousands more. Tonight, on Strange Bedfellows, our guest is Caleb Maupin, reporter for Russia's RT News. Caleb Maupin is also the founder of the Center for Political Innovation, or CPI, and he has a unique personal insight and experience on the current crisis in Yemen. He was on board an Iranian cargo ship headed for Yemen back in 2015, carrying humanitarian aid for the Red Crescent Society, when the ship became involved in a showdown on the high seas. Caleb Maupin is a widely acclaimed speaker, author, journalist, political analyst, and a self-described communist. The activist group he founded, CPI, has long advocated for the Houthis and the Palestinian liberation cause. The official slogan of the Houthi movement is, "God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel. A curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam." Why would a proud American like Caleb Maupin strongly support a movement that intends to destroy his country? He will tell us why on episode 24 of Strange Bedfellows.
Folks, I'm making this video because people don't seem to realize how serious the situation is right now. At this point, we've seen for the last few months how the Houthi forces in Yemen have been stopping ships to support the Palestinians. They've said that in order to support the Palestinians, they're not letting any ships pass through the Red Sea because Israel won't stop bombing Gaza. And so demanding that Israel stop bombing Gaza, they are blocking the Red Sea. Well, now we find out that the United States and the United Kingdom are on the brink of attacking the Houthi forces, the Yemeni Houthi Ansar Allah forces that have been blocking the Red Sea. The U.S. and the United Kingdom are on the brink of carrying out a major strike against the Yemenis. And now we also find out that in Iraq, the Shia militias that are aligned with Iran say that if that happens, they will unload on American bases. They are locked and loaded and ready. Hezbollah in Lebanon is also locked and loaded and ready. And if the United States and the United Kingdom go ahead and attack the Red Sea, this could be the beginning of World War III. This could be the beginning of a really, really ugly situation. They are locked and loaded all over the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in other places to just unload on American forces immediately. If this happens, this could be a disaster. A lot of American soldiers are going to be coming home in baddie bags. A lot of people are going to die. A lot of people have already died. The solution is that Israel needs to stop bombing Gaza. The whole world is asking for a ceasefire to protect Palestinian lives. And the United States seems to be just standing by and protecting Israel at the UN Security Council and doing everything they can to continue to let Israel continue its bombardment. Well, the whole world is against it. There are proceedings going on right now in the International Criminal Court of Justice against Israel brought by South Africa. The whole world is saying that Israel just needs to stop. And now the United States is on the brink of launching World War III by attacking Yemen, basically because they are so determined to protect Israel. This is outrageous. This is crazy. De-escalate now. This situation needs to de-escalate. This is a disaster. De-escalate now. Do not strike Yemen. Tell Israel to stop bombing Gaza. The USA needs to stay the hell out of the Red Sea. Hands off Yemen. Stop supporting Israel. Ceasefire now in Gaza.
Always helps if I unmute my microphone. Let me try that again. It's my pleasure to welcome back Caleb Maupin to Strange Bedfellows. Hi, Caleb. How are you?
I've been better, but I'm okay. I'm doing my job. Standing up for truth and justice in this world. Trying to finish my book on Yemen that should be out next week, but I have to finish writing it. I've never put out a book so quickly, but it needs to be written. So
my goodness, next week? That's amazing.
Yep. Yeah, got quite a deadline here.
Let's dive into the Middle East, shall we? There's so much to talk about. We have this crisis now on the Red Sea, and I was hoping that you could fill us in. We talked about it a little bit in the intro about your experience in 2015 when you were on that humanitarian aid ship. And tell me a little bit about how that influenced you politically and why you support the Houthi movement.
Well, there's a lot there, right? And, the reason I'm writing this book is because there is no official history of the Houthis on Amazon that you can buy. No one knows anything about them.
Interesting.
Yeah. I have been translating the sermons of their founder, Hussein al-Houthi, the minister who started their movement, who died in 2004, was killed, with an airstrike by the Yemeni military. I've been translating the speeches and the messages of the current leader of the movement, which is his brother, Malik Abdul al-Houthi. It was his brother who currently leads the movement. And I've been pulling up old documents and I've been piecing together. I'm writing a book to basically tell the story of who they are. This is a movement of people that want control of their country. They want economic development. That's what they want. And their official seal, which you don't see as much, right? You showed the other logo that they use, and we'll talk about that because I can understand why that would bother a lot of people. But this is their
understandably, yes.
Yeah. This is
Death to America is troubling.
Logo, like the official symbol, like the seal of the group.
Right, with the gun.
Yeah, and the gun, that actually, and a lot of people don't realize this, but in Yemen, there's this like curvy knife that all the men wear around their neck. It's called a jambra, something like that. And it's a religious item. It's kind of a symbol of Arab culture. They're not the only Arab country that does that.
But they believe, they interpret the Quran as saying that it's a man's duty to have a weapon to protect his home. He must protect his wife and children.
That's
so
right.
He's got to carry this knife around with him everywhere he goes. Well, the Houthis take that a step further, and they say, in this day and age, you have to have a gun. They are Second Amendment advocates. They believe in the right to bear arms.
That's right.
That's actually why the war started with the Yemeni government. The Yemeni government tried to take their guns away in 2003. And they said, no, we're going to maintain our right to bear arms. And they got into a civil war with the Yemeni government. But they believe that it is everyone's duty to have a gun. So they have a gun as their symbol there. But
And did you notice, I'm sure you did, the footage yesterday, the big rally there in Yemen, everybody had an AK-47.
Yeah.
Every single person in that crowd was waving a gun.
Yeah, and that's what and these are people who live in the mountains. It's a very mountainous country, and they live in northern Yemen, and in Sada province is kind of the base of the Houthi movement, which is very mountainous. And I think people don't realize how poor Yemen really is. Yemen, their population, 70% literacy, meaning 30% of the adults there cannot read or write. More than 1 in 4 adults in Yemen is not able to read or write. Okay. The life expectancy in Yemen is 67 years of age. That's 191st in the world in terms of life expectancy. This is according to the CIA World Factbook, by the way. In addition to that, Yemen has 31 million people. That's the population. 16 to 17 million of those people do not have electricity in their homes. That's more than half. More than half the people in the country do not have electricity. You're talking about people that are living in a level of poverty we cannot even imagine. Okay? I mean, these are people that don't have running water. These are people who have, never been to school in their lives, never had their kids get any education. These are people living up in the mountains. And in this particular region, they've been, for well over 1,000 years, they've practiced an interpretation of Islam. It's rather obscure, a form of Islam called Zaydism. And they are followers of Imam Zayd, who was a guy who led an uprising of the poor against the caliphate. The Islamic caliphate existed, and this guy, he led an armed uprising of the poor and the oppressed against the caliphate. And he was, shot through the head with an arrow and martyred. And they follow him as the last prophet, or the last imam, the last representative of God on earth. Is Imam Zayd. And they are Shia Muslims, but they're not the same kind of Shia that Iran are. Iran are 12 or Shia. And Zaydis, they pray like Sunnis do. They have the Sunni prayers that they practice. They're their own form of Islam that they've been practicing in this particular region for thousands of years. Zayd Shia Islam. And they believe you must have a firearm to protect your home. They believe it is the duty of all followers of God to stand with the oppressed. They say that a true imam is a fighting imam, meaning that if a religious leader does not take up a weapon and fight for the oppressed, he's not genuine. That is one of their beliefs. And they've been there. And what happened was that, you remember the Arab Spring?
Sure.
Yeah, well, Yemen had a dictator until then, a guy named Saleh. And Saleh was a very corrupt dictator. And Yemen, is deeply poor, even though it's got a huge amount of oil that just sits in the ground, and even though it's got a huge amount of arable land, but they import all their food from the United States and from Turkey and from other countries. They don't grow their own food. They don't use their oil. The Red Sea right next to them is a huge reservoir of natural gas. Right, the natural gas exploration of the Red Sea is coming up pretty soon. So they've got all kinds of natural resources.
That's why we're fighting over it, right?
Yeah, and it's a
Basically.
very, very wealthy country in terms of oil, in terms of arable agricultural land, in terms of natural gas. But the people there are poor, and it's just remaining in utter poverty. Well, this dictator Saleh, he was running the country, and in 2011, the whole country rose up against him in protest. And the Houthis had been fighting the government for a long time, and they already had a huge army, and they became the people who protected the protests during the Arab Spring. When the police would go out to arrest the protesters, the Houthi army would be there to protect them. And so they became very popular because they were protecting the protesters. They continued to be identified with the protest movements against Saleh, etc. And then the fuel subsidies were cut right? There's a subsidy in Yemen for gasoline, basically, to enable people to travel around. And President Saleh, the dictator, cut the fuel subsidies and made the cost of gas much higher. And so the Houthis said we're against that, and they organized thousands and thousands of people to go to the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, to protest against the cuts in fuel subsidies. And when they got there, they started taking over government buildings. And a lot of the government bureaucrats, a lot of the people in the military and a lot of people in the government, made friends with the Houthis and said these people probably would be better at running the country than our current leaders are. And so in January of 2015, they arrested the president and they announced that they were dissolving the House of Representatives, and that they announced that the Revolutionary Committee that they formed would be the new government. Now, the Houthis are a religious minority in Yemen. Only 35% of Yemenis have their religion, Zaidi Islam, right? So they are actually a coalition government. And that's when I've been, there's so much that people don't know about this, right? There are a number of political parties that are in the government with the Houthis. They have the army, this militia that's very, very big. They're very popular. But there is a feminist political party that is part of the Houthi government.
Now, that is surprising.
Yes, and you would never hear that, but it's called the Arab Hope Party. You can Google it, the Arab Hope Party. And it is headed by a woman, and she is a feminist and a pacifist. And some of the more hardcore Muslims really don't like her because she's led sit-ins and protests for women's rights. And so the Houthis have protected her and provided her with personal security protection to protect her from the more hardcore Muslims who don't like her. And she has seats in the government. She's a member of the Revolutionary Committee. She's represented, and she is like one of the major figures there, is this feminist pacifist. That you wouldn't know that.
I did not know that.
Yeah, another big factor in the Yemeni Revolutionary Committee are the communists, and no one talks about that either. The Yemeni Socialist Party. During the Cold War, Yemen was divided. It was North and South Yemen. South Yemen was ruled by the Yemeni Socialist Party. And they had, South Yemen had a big red star on their flag, and it was like a communist government. And then in 1990, as the Soviet Union was falling, South Yemen merged back into North Yemen. They became one country again. There was then another civil war in 1994 because the culture of South Yemen is very different than the culture of Northern Yemen. The people in Northern Yemen are in the mountains. They're very religious. The people in South Yemen, there's oil wells there, and they're a little more industrialized, and they're a little more secular. And things weren't going well. There was another civil war in 1994, but there's the people in South
Yemen has been rocked by civil war my whole life. That's all I know or remember about Yemen, was that they were always in a state of civil war, it seemed.
Yeah, and the Yemeni Socialist Party, which is the party, they call themselves the Yemeni Socialist Party. They're also called the Southern Movement. They want to restore the communism in the South. Now, they have changed their beliefs. They're not Marxist-Leninists anymore, I guess. They are Muslims now. They do recognize that Islam needs to be the basis of Yemeni law, but they are advocates of socialism. They admire Cuba. They admire North Korea. They admire China. But they're for, more of a secular government, but based on the Islamic teaching. And the Yemeni Socialist Party, the overwhelming majority of that party is part of the Yemeni government as well right now, in coalition with the Houthis, part of their Revolutionary Committee. There is a faction of the Yemeni Socialist Party that fled to Saudi Arabia and controls their website, but they don't represent the forces on the ground. The people in the government, they're called the Yemeni Socialist Party, anti-aggression, is what they're called. And they are a big part of the government there as well. So, because the Houthis are only 35% of the population in terms of religion, they are not going to be able to impose their religion on the whole country. That wouldn't work. What they want is the different regions to be allowed to practice their different faith and their different way of doing things their own way. And they want economic development. They want the oil to be nationalized. They want to start selling that oil to, build schools and hospitals and raise their people up. They want to start growing, crops on that arable land. They want to use that natural, and this logo that I showed you, right next to the gun. And this is the important thing. That's a shaft of wheat.
Mm-hmm.
And that stands for economic development. And that is one of the central slogans that the Houthis have everywhere. They say economic development. That's what they're demanding, is economic development. And, if you dig deeper into what the Houthi movement is really about, it is a movement against austerity. They are against cuts in public services. They are against cuts in aid. Hussein al-Houthi, he made fun of the Western governments for saying they support the rights of women. He said, how can you say that you support the rights of women when you don't provide food to mothers to feed their children? How can you say that you support the rights of women when you don't provide services for single mothers and you don't provide daycare and all of this? He says they think that the rights of women just means women, crowding into the offices and doing the jobs that men do, or women having seats in government. He said, but we believe that the rights of women means providing for people. That economic justice is really the foundation of their movement. Now that slogan that you recited there, those 5, slogans, right? It's,
death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, glory to Islam.
Well, look, I would obviously never support saying any of those things because I'm not a Muslim, but especially the 3, death to, curse upon. I would obviously never say those things here. But you have to understand you're dealing with some of the poorest people in the world whose existence is very, very tribal, right? There are networks of families that have been together for thousands of years that take care of each other. They view things in a very tribal and ethnic way. And to them, the Jews means Israel. And Israel, they consider to be a threat to them. And curse be upon, I've seen it translated as, death to the Jews. That is not what they said, right? It's curse be upon the Jews. And in the Shia Islamic tradition, they believe that if something is acquired or created in an impure way, it is therefore corrupted. They argue that, like, if you steal food and you eat it, that food will make you sick. It'll give you food poisoning. They believe if you build a house and you get a loan for that house, that doesn't follow the Islamic law, it's a dangerous house. It might catch on fire or fall down, right? And that if you create something in a sinful or impure way, it becomes cursed. So by saying curse upon the Jews, they're saying that what Israel has done is going to lead to a curse being upon the Jewish people. That's what they would argue. So, again, not the kind of slogan I would ever use, but in the context of Yemeni society, I can understand why they would say such things. And I would like to introduce them to the Jews that, like the Jews that were marching in the Capitol to oppose Israel, the Jewish Voices for Peace. I'd like to introduce them to Max Blumenthal or Peter Coffin or some of the Jewish folks who are big critics of Israel. And I'd like to introduce them to those folks, and maybe they would see things differently. But the way they see things, Jews means Israel. Israel does bad things, and there is a curse upon the Jews.
Right. And the group that you founded, CPI, Center for Political Innovation, I wanted to play a video here. I thought this was really cool, where you've been out protesting in support of Palestine, in support of the Houthis, and you recently released a video. Why do we support the Houthis? And I would like for our viewers to...
The Americans failed with all their capabilities at the beginning of the aggression against Yemen, and today they will fail even more and faster. Marches are taking place worldwide.
A sea of demonstrators, you can see for yourself, with many carrying Palestinian flags. A representative of the Houthi movement addressed the crowd, saying that its forces were ready to fight against both Israel and the US.
We will support our brothers in Palestine. We tell them they are not alone. God is supporting them, and we are with him too.
Today is part of an international mobilization in support of the Houthis.
We're here at this rally to support the Yemeni people. The people of Yemen are the heroes of the entire world for what they are doing right now.
And we're out here, we got leaflets, we got signs.
We realize the aggression on Gaza and all these crimes are a joint American-British-Israeli action. Whoever stands with them bears responsibility for what happens in Gaza.
20,000 plus people killed in Gaza as Israel unleashes its horrendous crimes.
But the Houthis in Yemen, the poorest country on the planet, they're actually doing something about it. They're turning the ships around. They're saying no ships to Israel until the bombing stops. No ships until there's no more bombing.
Enforcing a naval blockade against Israel in solidarity with the people of Gaza.
Yemen, make us proud. Turn another ship around.
This is a picket line in the Red Sea. Do not cross. They are standing against Israeli atrocities. They are stopping those scab ships that are cooperating with Israel. And this is a heroic act of solidarity.
Thanks to heroes in Red Sea, Palestine will be free. Thanks to heroes in Red Sea, Palestine will be free.
And if you think about that, I see America in Ansar Allah. This is a group of people that call themselves supporters of God, that believe in economic development.
Because they're doing the same thing that the people in the American Revolution did. They're standing up against an international colonial system.
And I really want everyone watching now to think about what it means to be an American. What does it mean to be somebody here in the United States of America? Because this is a country that was founded by people from all different corners of the world, endured all kinds of hardship, people from all over the planet who come to the United States of America because they believe that they can get a better life for their family, because they can survive horrendous conditions. Many of them motivated by belief in God and belief that there is a higher purpose and they can build a better life. I have actually here these buttons with the symbol, the official symbol of Ansar Allah on them. And as you can see, you know, one of the things that's very prominently featured on their symbol is a gun. Because part of the Ansar Allah religion, part of the teachings of Zaydi Shia Islam is that every man must have a gun to protect his household. They believe in the right to bear arms. What could be more American than that? In addition, they have a shaft of wheat. There's a shaft of wheat that is perpendicular to the gun. That stands for economic development, meaning that they don't believe in this degrowth environmentalism that's being pushed by the fake left. They believe that they can make a better life for their children, make a better life. They want to use Yemen's oil resources to build up their economy and raise their people up from poverty.
No war with Yemen! No war with Yemen! No war with Yemen!
People in one of the poorest countries in the world, in the mountains of northern Yemen, the Ansar Allah movement, the followers of Hussein al-Houthi, the poorest people in the world are standing up and fighting back. They have picked up a gun and they are fighting for their people.
The Yemeni people will not tolerate any American intervention or guardianship. We are ready for confrontation.
The aggression against Yemen has been US-led from the beginning. We are prepared for everything. We realize that if we do not make a sacrifice now, we will later when we are oppressed and defeated.
You know, the Bible says that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And if you think about it, if you think about what's happening in the world now, Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, is making itself heard all over the planet.
The Houthis are heroes. If the American people knew what they were doing, right, they would be supporting it.
You know, Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution, he said, the people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country, but only if they dare to rise and struggle, only if they dare to take up arms and grasp into their own hands the destiny of their country. And the people of Yemen have done that.
If the American forces present in the Red Sea commit foolish acts against the Yemeni people, whether against the Navy, against Yemen in general, or against Yemen's interests, the Yemeni people will not stand idly by, and the armed forces will not stand idly either. American naval units will become targets, along with those who support and back them.
What we're looking at today is another miracle in the Red Sea. Pharaoh didn't learn his lesson the last time. And if Pharaoh Biden sends American troops to try to fight in the Red Sea, he's going to meet the same fate as the hero in the Old Testament did.
If you truly love America, if you truly love everything this country was meant to stand for, when it emerged as a revolution against the British Empire, you should love the Houthis right now. You should love the people of Yemen and admire them. They are standing against the Atlanticist system, this global system of free trade. They are stopping that free trade. They are stopping the shift. They are standing for economic development. They are shutting it down. They are the heroes of the people of the world. They stand for economic development. They stand for the rights of people, the rights of justice and truth against the system that puts profit and monopoly, big banks and corporations over human lives. We admire the Houthis. The Houthis are the hero of the whole world. We stand with you from Bronx to Chicago to Portland to every corner of this country. There are Americans that hear your call and stand with you. Shut it down. Solidarity with Ansar Allah, solidarity with Yemen, solidarity with Gaza, free Palestine, down with U.S. imperialism.
The poorest nation on the planet is doing more than all the richest nations put together to defend decency and oppose genocide. They're doing what America should be doing, and we at the Center for Political Innovation support them.
And then we crossed that bridge into China, saw a great banner up ahead. Its meaning set my heart a pounding, and this is what that banner is. Long live the great unity of the peoples of the world. Long live the great unity of the peoples of the world. Long live the great unity of the peoples of the world. Long live the great unity of the peoples of the world. Dare to struggle! Dare to struggle!
The government of Sana'a, because it makes its own decisions, isn't hostage to the American colonial project and has witnessed the atrocities of the American Zionist colonial project. The world, if it continues to watch the heinous crimes in Gaza and Palestine, will pay a high price in the future. Because this is the message of the new colonial project. Whoever stands against it will face a fate similar to that of the people of Gaza. China, Russia, and India and other countries won't accept American, British, Israeli dominance.
The Houthis are heroes. Houthis are heroes. Houthis are heroes. Houthis are heroes.
The Houthis are heroes, says John McCarthy. In that clip, he compared President Biden to Pharaoh, which I thought was interesting. Pharaoh didn't learn his lesson, right? So we have to teach him. And God knows I'm no fan of President Biden. But when I hear talk like that from the Houthis, even from the Palestinians, that they want to destroy us, they call us the American Zionist colonialist project, make that make sense. How can I possibly support that as an American? I mean, I take that as a threat.
Well, when you say American Zionist colonialist project, that refers to Israel, right? I mean, it's,
and us.
No, I think that refers to the Americans are the main sponsors of this project that was started in 1947, really before that with the Balfour Declaration, to set up a country for one race, for one ethnicity, in Palestine, right? It's a colonial project that was backed by the Americans, right?
And the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that Israel, as we know it, wouldn't exist today had it not been for the Soviet Union's advocacy at the United Nations in 1948.
And they learned from that real quick, because about a year afterwards, they found all kinds of networks of Israeli spies all throughout, Eastern Europe and different places. And pretty soon they learned that was a big mistake. But you are correct. Coming out of the Second World War, a lot of people saw the horrors of the Holocaust and thought,
right,
the Jewish people have been through so much. We can give them a homeland. They'll be progressive. They'll be anti-fascist because of what they went through. And, when Israel started, it presented itself like it was a big socialist commune in the desert. There were a lot of older communists I know who walked around. They used to sell the Daily Worker half the day and Trees for Israel the next, and that was. But after a while, the nature of Israel became pretty clear. In 1978, the election of Menachem Begin as prime minister was a pretty big turning point.
I remember. I'm so old, I remember that.
There you go.
And I do remember Menachem Begin.
There was always a hard right wing in Israeli Zionism, right? You had the main current was Haganah, the Israeli Labor Party, which presented itself as socialist. But then you had Irgun, right? And Irgun were, the founders of what became the revisionist party, revisionist Zionism, which is Netanyahu's party now. Likud is the continuity of. And they actually celebrated the rise of Hitler in Germany because they said it would cause more Jews to have to move to Palestine. And they said that, deep down, all non-Jews are like Hitler. Deep down, all non-Jews are just bloodthirsty anti-Semites. So there's nothing particularly wrong with Hitler. And he'll show Jews throughout Germany they have to come to Israel. And they celebrated the rise of Hitler. Irgun, which is interesting, there was a divide. The bulk of the Zionist movement supported the British during the Second World War, but Irgun supported the Nazis, because they were convinced the Nazis would draw up a treaty with them and let all the Jews of Europe be transported to Palestine. And so they carried out terrorist attacks against the British during the Second World War. And that's the roots of right-wing Israeli politics, right? So it's very interesting. It took a while for Israel to kind of shed its kind of leftist pretensions. But I think, you have to remember until the end of the Second World War, Zionism was the minority among Jews in the world. Most Jews until the Second World War were Marxists or socialists. And it wasn't until the Holocaust, which killed off millions of Jewish people, the majority of which were socialists or communists. And in Britain is where the Jews were not killed, because Britain was not taken over by the Nazis. And Britain was the stronghold of the Zionist movement. That's where it was headquartered out of. That's where the World Zionist Organization and Theodore Herzl were set up. And so they had, dominance among, discourse among the Jewish world at that point. And then on top of that, the Holocaust had happened, and it was a horrendous thing. 6 million people exterminated horrendously, and based on that, there was a feeling that there had to be the creation of a homeland. But
I just wanted to interject too, if I may. Stalin had tried since the 1920s to establish autonomous zones in the Soviet Union with the idea of keeping the Jews safe at home. He wasn't really a big fan of Zionism or this whole idea of creating a homeland for the Jews in the Middle East, because obviously he understood that was going to be a problem for the native Arabs who were already on that land. So unfortunately, his various experiments, and not a lot of people know, but there was an autonomous zone in Crimea. They called it the Crimean California in the 1930s. And, Jews, the idea was to keep them safe there. There was another autonomous zone way the hell out in Siberia and in other places of the Soviet Union. But all of these experiments, unfortunately, failed, as we all know.
There's a little more to that. Lenin was very much an advocate of nationalism. Right. Marx had said there is no nation, right? Workers, the world unite. There is no nationality. But Lenin came along and he said, well, there are oppressed nations and oppressor nations. And an oppressed nation is something that you should support. And so when the Soviet Union was created, they had two bodies. They had the Supreme Soviet, and then they had the House of Nationalities. And he went around throughout the former Russian Empire that was becoming the Soviet Union, and he found groups of people that had a particular dialect or language, and he said, you are now a nation, and as a nation, you have your territory, and we're going to help you. And a lot of these people didn't have their own separate written language yet, but we're going to help you develop your own written language.
Like the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and Putin actually argues that really hurt the Soviet Union in the long term, because these are people that maybe there was a different dialect and different cultural things, but they're the same people. They were the same part of the same civilization, the Russian Empire. And that by going around and pointing to all these different groups and saying, you are now a nation, here are the borders of your national territory, here's your separate, we're going to help you develop a separate written language, and that kind of planted the seeds of division. I don't know. I'm not from there. And it's not for me to say. I would never tell a Ukrainian that they're not the same, they're not a different nationality. It's not for me to say. And this is things that Russians and Ukrainians and Moldovans and Latvians argue about all the time. Not for me to jump into it. But the Jewish autonomous regions were created because of the fact that Jews were considered to be a separate nationality. And according to the Leninist theory, the Marxist-Leninist theory, they should then have their own territory, their own written language, etc. And to this day, the biggest menorah in the world is in Russian. It's in one of these, Jewish autonomous regions. There were also a number of American communist Jews who moved to the Soviet Union to live there. And there were some older communists who could sing for me. I can't do it because I don't speak Yiddish. There's a song in Yiddish that was popular, and it's like the lyrics translate to something like, who says that Jews can't be farmers, come to the Jewish autonomous region. And that there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of American Jews who were in the Communist Party who packed up and moved to the Jewish autonomous region. So that's
so
wild,
true.
It's a wild story. Another interesting thing was that at the time of the Russian Revolution, Lenin himself was Jewish. His mother was Jewish, and he was Jewish by heritage. He was an atheist. But, there were many Russian Jewish communists who felt that the Jews had to have a separate communist party, and they called themselves the Bundists. And Lenin hated the Bundists, and he said that is crazy. We have to have one party for all the different nationalities. And Lenin spent a lot of his time fighting with the Bundist party, which was this party that said that Jews had to have their own party. The other thing is that there was something called labor Zionism, right, which is the theory that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine, but it should be a socialist state.
That was the idea for some.
Yeah, labor Zionism. And during the Russian Civil War, the labor Zionists joined the Bolsheviks because the white army was so anti-Semitic and was killing Jewish villages.
That's
The labor Zionists actually did join up with the Bolsheviks, and then many of them did just end up leaving and moving to Palestine at the time. But so there's some complicated history there.
Oh, it's really complicated.
It is.
And the most fascinating thing, Caleb, and why I wanted to have this talk with you, because I know you're a student of history too, and the Cold War. And the most fascinating thing about it is how the alliances shifted, literally turned on their ear, right? In the beginning, the Soviets were very supportive of the Zionist project in Palestine. And of course, they did so because their enemy in World War II were the Palestinians. Of course, they weren't called the Palestinians at the time. They were just referred to as the Arabs. But, you know, you had guys like the Grand Mufti, Amin al-Husani, who was a Nazi collaborator. He was like the Stefan Bandera of the Arab world.
Well, that's a bit of a stretch. See, now,
you think?
1936, right? The Jewish settlers who had come to Palestine, right? They were fighting with the Arabs, and the Arabs didn't like them, and there was the Arab local population was fighting with them. So the British sent their military to the British Mandate of Palestine to protect the Jewish settlers. The Soviet Union supported the Arabs. They said this is British imperialism, and they said that they called out the Jewish settlers for basically functioning as foot soldiers of the British Empire. And then when World War II broke out, all over the world, you had many, many people, including Gandhi, for example, including the IRA, including all kinds of South American leaders who were not communists. They were not communists, so they were not loyal to the Soviet Union. And their enemy was the British or the Americans. And so they immediately went and tried to make deals with Hitler. And that happened all over the world. Kenya is a great example. There's a photograph, I think someone has dug up, of Adolf Hitler talking to a black African Kenyan fighter against the British who he met with. And Gandhi wrote a horrendous letter to Adolf Hitler. Go Google Gandhi's letter.
Seen it.
Yeah, that among the Arabs who were not communists, which there was a very strong communist current in Palestine that didn't support Hitler, obviously.
That is correct.
You know, but that guy, Grand Mufti, he was not a communist, and his enemy...
Oh, he hated the communists. He wanted to kill every last communist on the planet, and they did kill a hell of a lot of communists with their Waffen SS divisions in North Africa.
And his main enemy was the British and the Zionist settlers that were aligned with them, and he wasn't a communist, so it was kind of enemy is my friend kind of logic.
Indeed.
And that was, it's unfortunate. And,
but he was also, let's be honest, he was a very enthusiastic Nazi. He very quickly got into bed with Hitler as early as 1933, spent the entirety of World War II in Berlin doing propaganda for the Arab world for the Nazis, made sure that Mein Kampf was translated into the Arabic and widely distributed, and whipped up the Arab world to go kill the Jews. I mean, that was the whole idea.
His enemy was the British, and the British were aligned with the settlers that were coming into his country. I mean,
right. I understand his reasons.
And he wasn't a communist. And so why would he be, the communists had the position that you should align with the democratic Americans, British West against the Nazis. But he didn't think that, that wasn't his attitude, because he, so that's the way he saw it. Have you ever read Native Son by Richard Wright?
Son. By whom?
Richard Wright. It's one of the most famous African-American novels.
Heard of it, but I don't know if I've read it.
You read it in a lot of American literature classes. It's an African-American writer who was a Communist Party member named Richard Wright. He wrote this book. It's about Bigger Thomas, who is a young African-American man who lives in Chicago, and he's hired to work in a white woman's house, and he accidentally kills her, and then he gets like the death penalty. It was considered but the opening scene in the book is Bigger Thomas, this character who's supposed to be a young black man from Chicago in 1939. He goes to the movies with his best friend, and he's in the movie theater with his best friend. And before the movie starts, they have a newsreel of Adolf Hitler. And he's sitting there in the movie theater with his best friend, and he sees Hitler on the screen shouting about how he's going to fight for his race, and he's going to fight for the Aryan race and for his people. And Bigger Thomas, the fictional character in this award-winning African novel, turns to his best friend and he says, "We need somebody like that for our people. We need a black Hitler." Right. And that was the Nation of Islam, the organization of Malcolm X. They made similar statements themselves. Right. It was a feeling of, we need someone to fight for our race. And it's very tragic, right? And again, this is when you don't have the science of Marxism, this leads to a lot of confusion. And also, to be fair, the communists made a lot of mistakes during this period, because the understanding was, and I agree with this, that the Nazis were the main threat and that everything had to be done to defeat the Nazis. There were a lot of people around the world who were colonized by the British, and that their national liberation struggle kind of got put on hold, right? And that's why India didn't have a communist revolution after World War II, because during World War II, the communists of India said, we got to team up with the British because the Nazis are the main threat. And a lot of people in India are like, the Nazis are a threat? Why are they a threat? We're being colonized by the British. We've never met a German in our lives. And there were many Indian national liberation fighters who said the British are the main threat and we don't care about the Nazis. There was a lot of Japanese funding during World War II of Indian nationalists. And so coming out of World War II, the nationalist anti-communist current among the Indian national liberation struggle had the upper hand, right? And that there are many examples of this, throughout the world, and that in some places the communists kind of went over the top with their support for the United States and Britain against the Nazis. The United States, the Communist Party of the United States, it collaborated with Japanese internment, for example. Did you know that? Yeah, yes. The Communist Party of the United States, they sent a letter to every single Japanese member and basically kicked them out of the party and told them to comply with internment. That's reprehensible, right? It was obviously right to support the USA against the Nazis and against Japan, but you shouldn't be, complying with Japanese internment. And they should have found a way that they could at least oppose Japanese internment or make a statement against it, but still support the country against the Nazis, right? And I think, and that goes to show you that, when you're on the right side of things, you can often overlook the bad things you might be doing, right? You get kind of a
So by that logic, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
By that logic, should we then forgive and understand and defend the Ukrainians' reasons in World War II for their alliance with Nazi Germany? Because their goals, their stated goals, were exactly the same as the goals of Amin al-Husseini and the liberation movement of the Arabs. They wanted two things. They wanted a homeland, a state, and they wanted to kill Jews. And by that logic, they both allied themselves with Hitler for the same reasons, and they hated communists. Would the Ukrainians not also fall into that same category? Are they the bad Nazis and the Arabs were the good Nazis? Or how exactly do you view that?
Well, first of all, I don't think that what the Mufti was doing was correct, but I'm explaining why he made the mistake that he made and why that current existed. So I don't endorse that move, right? I think that was absolutely wrong for him to take that position, but it was based on the fact that he wasn't a communist, that he represented the nationalist bourgeoisie of the Arab world that took that position. It was anti-communist, but was also anti-British. So that's the first thing. I don't endorse the Mufti. Second of all, the second thing is, though, that's not a fair comparison to make, because the only reason Ukraine had its own written language is because of the Soviet Union. And as Vladimir Putin has pointed out many, many times, the entire concept of a Ukrainian nation is something that Lenin and the Soviet Union invented. So taking up arms against the Soviet Union in the name of a Ukrainian nation is illogical. Ukrainian.
It was treasonous. That was their country.
Well, it doesn't even make any sense, right? There would be no Ukrainian nationalism if the Soviet Union hadn't come along and said, you're a nation. Here's your border. We're going to help you develop your own written language. So, It doesn't make sense. Ukrainian nationalism was invented, as the 1930s got going, right? It was invented kind of to go along with. Whereas the Arab people, I think, you and I would both agree that the Arab people have been around for thousands of years. Their language is their language. Their history is their history. One thing that I would think is a fair point is that, when we talk about Palestinians and Jordanians and Saudis and such, and this is one thing that defenders of Israel will point out, and I don't agree with what they're trying to say when they point it out, but they're pointing to something that is true, that is that there is one Arab people, right? There's not separate nationalities among the Arab people, right? Those borders of the Middle East were drawn up by the European colonizers at the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mm-hmm. And it had nothing to do with culture or anything. It was simply based on who got control of the oil, and they gave Saudi Arabia to the House of Saud because they were their foot soldiers. They gave Jordan to the Hashemite, royal, they drew up those borders purely for colonial reasons. Syria was given to the French, and there's one Arab nation, and there's one Arab people. And I think that eventually there will be one Arabia. And that'll be a part of the world moving away from imperialism will be, I support pan-Arabism, so to speak, right? The idea of one Arab nationality. So it gets very confusing when you start trying to divide up the Arab people of who's a Palestinian, who's an Arab, who's an Iraqi. I mean, there's one Arab people. Now, Iranians are Persian.
And yet so many different sects and tribes within that larger movement, right?
Right. But they are one people. And so,
they're often fighting with each other.
Well,
right? As we saw in Yemen over the last 30 years or more.
Sure, and that has been to the benefit of those who divided them. I think that's in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. That's one thing that he says. He says, the fact that they've divided you based on tribe, so there you go.
Exactly. And, speaking of those shifting alliances, after World War II, after the creation of Israel, tell me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is the Soviet Union strongly supported the Zionist project in Israel, not just because they felt the Jews needed a homeland, but also because they understood what it was like to have a newborn country, the Soviet Union, invaded and surrounded by enemies on their borders. They had gone through that after the First World War, right? During the Russian Civil War, and they were constantly under threat throughout their entire existence from NATO, et cetera, and that's still going on today. And, of course, the alliances shifted, certainly after the Six-Day War, when then you see literally the Mufti and his protege, Yassar Arafat, they got in bed with the communists. Their former enemies, they then became allies because, of course, the United States cozied up to Israel. And so there was all this Cold War tension that I think was a major factor in all of this. What do you think?
I don't think that narrative is correct in many ways. Until the Second World War, until like the end of the Second World War, Marxism, the Bolsheviks had always taken the position. They said Zionism is a reactionary trend of the Jewish bourgeoisie. They had always considered that. 1936, when the British military goes to defend the Zionist settlers in Palestine, the Soviet Union is saying, no, we support the Arabs against them. They were totally against that.
Even though the weird part is the Arabs thought that all of the communists were Jews and therefore they had to kill them.
Well, the Arab bourgeoisie, the Grand Mufti thought that, but there were a lot of communists who didn't think that. So,
it's complicated.
It is complicated.
Very complicated.
Yeah, right. But the Grand Mufti certainly thought that because he was a bourgeois nationalist, right? He was just like the people in South America who hated communists, but also didn't like the United States and were friendly with Franco and Spain. And so, they thought communism was a Jewish conspiracy, but they also, didn't like the Americans. So they were sympathetic to fascism. And that represented his views, but it didn't represent all the Palestinians' views. And the line of the communists was that Western imperialism is always the main danger. So even if people hate us, right, we're still against Western imperialism, right? We're still support national liberation. And supporting Israel was like a kind of a blip. It was like a temporary thing that was
about 20 years, right?
No, I mean, it was almost immediately. The Israelis started accusing the Soviet Union of anti-Semitism, like starting in the early 50s. Almost immediately after,
because of the doctor's plot and all that.
Right, and that they were constantly feeding the press allegations of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. Circumcision.
Was it true?
Well, circumcision was illegal in the Soviet Union because it was considered child abuse.
Right.
And they're not a religious country. They don't have special, protections for religious practices in the Soviet Union. So they said, you want to do that to a child? We're not okay with that. Circumcision was illegal. Right now, it's funny. I used to live in Kew Gardens in Queens. That was the neighborhood I used to live in. And there would be guys who would knock on your door to raise money, for their cause. And they would be with the Lubavitch organization. And one of their charities was to circumcise men in the former Soviet Union because circumcision was illegal. So they have a charity to donate money to go to the former Soviet Union and circumcise men. So I always thought that was very funny, and that's how I learned that circumcision was illegal in the Soviet Union because the Lubavitch guys knocked on my door and wanted me to give them $2 to help circumcise men in the former Soviet Union. So, there you go. But look, I mean, there's no question there was anti-Semitism in Russia, and there still is. I mean,
We just saw the Dagestan airport incident.
And now that, from what I understand, now those were Muslims, right? That was in a Muslim area, right? And that now they're saying that there was a lot of Ukrainian bots and trolls who made that happen. Have you heard of that?
Indeed, yes.
Oh, yeah, that was.
They were stirring them up on social media, but of course, the anti-Semitism was already there. It was just inflamed by this Ukrainian disinformation operation.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a big rise in anti-Semitism. In the 1990s, there was a big rise of anti-Semitism in Russia because the United States had put sanctions on Russia for allegedly mistreating the Jews, right? You remember that in the 80s?
Yes, I do.
Free Soviet Jews, Soviet Jews, etc. And then when the Soviet Union fell and, the country was starving and economically suffering, if you were Jewish, you could just get on a plane and go to Israel.
And a lot of them did.
Yeah, and there were many Russians who were like, wow, you guys were never really loyal to us, and now you're just going to leave us. And, there was ethnic bigotry against Jews in the 1990s. There were a lot of hate crimes and things like that went on. And that's, obviously something the Russian authorities are very opposed to, any form of bigotry, any form of hatred. But, and also that gave a boost to Netanyahu because the Jews who came to Israel in like the 40s and 50s tended to be more liberal. But the Jews from Eastern Europe tend to be more conservative, right? And that they're the ones that are going to the settlements, and they're the ones that are hardcore Netanyahu supporters. And the shift, when we talk about Menachem Begin, the shift in Israeli politics really got a huge boost in the 90s from the expats from the former Soviet Union.
That's right. And let's bring it up to, say, the last 20 years or so, or 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Netanyahu, coinciding almost exactly with the rise of Putin in Russia. And I did a video last week, I don't know if you saw it, but it was like an exploration of the Israeli-Russia kinship, which is how Putin referred to it. I mean, Israel, in so many ways, is like little Russia over in the Middle East, right? You've got a huge Russian population. You've got dual citizens who bounce back and forth. They actually have polling stations set up across Israel so that Russian people can vote in Russian elections. Putin, in 2018, overwhelmingly elected. 73% of Israeli Russians voted for him. He's very popular there. And up until pretty recently, just the last few years, and really since the Ukraine-Russia conflict began, Russia and Israel had a lovely relationship. Putin and Netanyahu had kind of a bromance going, and there was all this cultural exchange and, a nice alliance. And even under tremendous pressure after the war in Ukraine started, from the United Nations, from the United States, for Israel to sanction Russia, to provide military support to Ukraine. Israel resisted all of that. They remained a loyal friend to Russia throughout it all. Now, they did buckle at the UN Security Council on that one vote, but they never really condemned the annexation of Crimea, and they stayed loyal. So then after October 7th happened, it took 10 days for Putin to call Netanyahu with his condolences. We've seen Russia at the UN Security Council, condemning Israel. And I think that there are many Russians in Israel who are very confused right now and feel betrayed by Putin kind of not only turning his back on them, but it almost feels like a thumb in the eye.
I've observed this, everything you're talking about. Like, I've observed this like up close, and I think it's not as.
What are your thoughts?
As you're putting it. I mean, for number one, Ukraine and Israel's relationship. There was Israeli involvement in Euromaidan, from what I understand.
Was there?
Yeah, and that there was, the Ukrainian military and the Israeli military have like traded weapons with each other, and there's a lot of Israeli involvement in Ukraine, from what I understand. So that's the first thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is I actually lived this because I go to these international conferences in Russia, and so I would see, all the Arab countries and Iran and other countries and Israel in the same room, and I would watch them argue with each other, and that was amusing. In 2017 at the World Youth Festival that happened, that I was at, right? It was all of Russia's friends from all over the world, including Israel. and they have a flag of every country out in front of the festival. One of those countries was Israel, and so people from the Arab countries and the Iranians started protesting in front of the Israeli flag in front of the festival. And they stopped participating in the festival and just were protesting out in front. How dare there be this Israeli flag there? And then an Iranian student climbed up the flagpole and ripped the Israeli flag down, and the Russian police arrested him. And he went to jail for disturbing the peace or something like that. And so that was like the big incident that happened at the World Youth Festival.
Now that you bring that up, I do remember that. I had forgotten it. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing was, one time I was at a conference. I think it was the World Conference of Parliamentarians, where they had parliamentarians from Israel, members of parliament from Israel, and members of parliament from Syria and from Iran and from a number of countries. And, the Israeli guy got up and made his speech, and then the Syrians and the Iranians were all getting up and just unloading their anger, and the Russians were like pulling the microphones away from them and saying, okay, do not disrespect our guests, please cut this out, and what I often thought was odd, and I'll just tell you, this is, and I'm an American, right? I'm not a Russian, so I'm just seeing this as an observer. It seems like Russia was friends with the most extreme of both sides. You understand? Because the
yes.
Israelis that Russia was friends with were like the most far-right Netanyahu Israelis.
True
right?
that.
And the Iranians and the Arabs, that Russia's friends with, they're the anti-imperialists. They're the ones that are just like, Palestine forever, And it seemed like, it was like Russia was friends with like the most extreme of both sides. I thought that was just like an odd.
Well, yeah. Imagine how the Russian Israelis felt when they saw Hamas meeting with Russian diplomats right after October 7th. Imagine how that felt.
Well, but then, again, there's been Russian involvement in Euromaidan and with Ukraine and all of that. And there's been, and again, and Iran is very close to Russia, right? And, Netanyahu seems to believe that if he can trick the USA into having a war with Iran, he'll be set politically, right? If he can, and he's doing everything he can with these assassinations and everything to just go full speed. Let's just make sure that somehow out of October 7th, we get a U.S. war with Iran, and then he'll be safe politically.
That's insane. That's completely insane.
Yeah, that's what he's determined to do. Yeah. And Iran is a very close friend of Russia. So, that raises some questions. But yeah, at this point, Russia is pretty, and I went to the International Council of the World Youth Festival, right? There's going to be a World Youth Festival in March coming up. And I went to the planning meeting in November. There weren't any Israelis at that planning meeting. Let me just put it that way. And the room erupted into free Palestine many, many times. And it looks to me like Israel and Russia are not on good terms with each other. And I don't know if you saw the clip that went viral of an Israeli threatening the RT host on air. Did you see that?
No.
There was a guest from Israel who was being interviewed on RT, and in the middle of his interview, he said, "We will remember you betrayed Israel, Mr. Putin. We are watching you." Watch the clip. It's like insane. Like, this Israeli guest is basically threatening, Russia, threatening Putin on the air, and the host is watching this. The anchor is sitting there, and he's just like, is this for real? Is this happening? Is this guy and this pro-Israel guest has like a meltdown on the air and is threatening Russia and threatening Putin on the air. It was like something.
Oh my God, I have to see that.
After this, Russia will pay the price. Believe me, Russia will pay the price. Russia is supporting the enemies of Israel. Russia is supporting Nazi people who want to commit genocide on us. And just Russia will pay the price. Russia also. Now, listen to me very carefully. We are going to finish with these Nazis. We're going to win this war. It's going to take the time it's going to take, but we're going to win this war. Afterwards, we're not forgetting what you are doing. We're not forgetting. We will come. We will make sure that Ukraine wins. We will make sure that you pay the price for what you have done. You as Russia, and you and as all the enemies of Israel, and you as all the people who are now making everything they can to support genocide of the Jews in Israel. We are not forgetting. We are not forgetting. Remember exactly what I'm saying now. You will pay the price.
Amir, I think it's safe to say that this is a very passionate conflict that is happening here.
Well, people have been massacred. My people has been slaughtered by your proxies, and you will pay the price. Is it clear? Believe me, you will
I don't actually think it is clear.
Very, very, very sternly.
I don't think it is clear, Mr. Weidman, and I would suggest
well, then it should be
in the
clear.
future,
it should be clear.
As being a politician,
it should be clear to you, because you have to understand that actions have got consequences. And when people support murder of Jews, people pay the price. This is true in Gaza. This is true everywhere else. The time that Jews actually have no power to defend themselves is gone. And people will now have to bear the consequences of them supporting genocidal Nazis who are out to exterminate Jews. What we have seen 10 days ago is not something normal. We have seen these Nazis going out, massacring people in the streets, babies, beheading them, older people, women, raping, all these things. You've seen them with your eyes. How can you even dare to support the murderers? I tell you frankly, the public opinion in Israel has changed. We are not now where we were 10 days ago.
Yeah, but, but that's it.
But that's how they feel, and they have a legitimate reason to feel that way right now. And, it's just my personal opinion, for what it's worth. When I study the Cold War, I think that one of the big mistakes that the Soviet Union made that eventually did contribute to their downfall and their getting involved in that quagmire in Afghanistan was getting in bed with their former enemy, to get in bed with the Arab cause and to fund terrorist militias all over the world so that they could free Palestine, ended up backfiring on them in a big way. And I have great respect for Vladimir Putin. I support Russia in this war against Ukraine. After October 7th, when I saw Russia cozying up to Hamas, it rubbed me the wrong way. I'm not going to lie to you. I felt that it was a terrible betrayal of the special relationship that they've had with Israel for so long now. And I sympathized and empathized with the Russian Jews in Israel and the Israelis living in Russia and how they feel right now. And most of all, I worry that Putin might be repeating the same mistake that his Soviet predecessors made. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you and I just have a very different perspective on this whole
We
situation.
do.
So,
but that's okay.
But I think an important thing to point out is, where did Hamas come from?
Right.
Hamas was the anti-communist wing of the Palestinian
right. Yeah,
that we now know got supported
the anti-Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, got supported by Israel as a way to oppose the communist wing of things, right? And we also know that the friends of the Soviet Union in the Arab world were generally the secular folks, right? It was Saddam Hussein, Ba'athist Arab socialism, and that it was the United States, that was backing the Wahhabis, the more fanatical religious wing of things. And that when the Soviet Union fell, there was a huge wave of Islamicization, of the Middle East, and the politics in the Middle East very much shifted away from secular anti-imperialism toward, Islamic stuff. There is an exception to that, which is the Islamic Revolution of Iran. The Islamic Revolution of Iran is deeply religious and deeply anti-imperialist, and the USA didn't support it. And so that's kind of the exception. But they're Shias. They're not Sunnis, right? And so that's a little bit different, right? And that they, the Shia tradition, kind of like with the Houthis, they have this whole thing about standing with the oppressed. The difference between the Sunnis and the Shias, in my interpretation as a non-Muslim, is that, that after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there was a divide in the Muslim world between the old feudal rulers, the kings, and the mercantile class, the merchants, the capitalists, right? And as the feudal wing of the Islamic world was kind of fighting the power of the mercantile capitalists, they became the champions of poor people and the champions of the oppressed. And they became the champions of the downtrodden, and they emphasized martyrdom and sacrifice for what is right. And that's where Shia Islam kind of comes from. It's, these imams, the 12 imams, or 5 imams if you're a Zaidi, who came after the Prophet Muhammad, who kind of made it their mission to mobilize the poor people to fight against the capitalists, the emerging capitalist class. And it's very interesting history. And then I would argue that also the 1979 revolution, and again, some of my Iranian friends would be very unhappy to hear me say this, but I don't think that you could have had an Islamic revolution of Iran in 1979 without Marxism. Even though they repudiate Marxism, I have gone to Iran, I've gotten a number of their books, I mean, Marxism, communism was really big in the 1970s all over the world. The peak of communism in the world was 1978, I believe, the year before the Islamic Revolution. And if you read Khomeini, you know, he wasn't a Marxist, but Marxism was so much a part of the political atmosphere at that time. Talk of class struggle, talk of revolution for the oppressed, talk of women's rights, talk of all kinds of things was such a big part of that current that I think that the Shia Islam as we now see it in the world today is very, very heavily influenced by Marxism.
True.
Yeah.
And in fact, I wish that Rick Walker could have joined us tonight. He was planning to, and then he sent me a message saying he had a pounding headache and he was just going to go to bed. But on Maverick News tonight, I don't know if you caught the show, our guest, Joseph Lenard, we were talking about all the Free Palestine protests around the country and around the world. And you trace the funding of that and you wonder, are these people getting paid? Right. So the report tonight, the special report, was about the funding of the Free Palestine protests. And of course, our guest, Joseph Lenard, argued that it's all a big Marxist conspiracy. And it's China and it's Russia and it's Iran funding all of this. Do you have any thoughts on that? Well, Are you getting paid to go out and protest in New York, Caleb?
I will admit, and again, this is something that Zionists say that I agree with, but I have a different interpretation of, but it's something that's worth pointing out that a lot of pro-Palestine people don't admit. There's a lot of money that goes into Palestine stuff, right? Mm-hmm. You know, if you're
huge propaganda,
but operation. A lot of that money, it's wasted. And I would argue, like, for example, there's a magazine in Washington, D.C. called the Washington Report. Do you know this magazine?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it used to be you'd go to an anti-war protest and you could get a free copy of it. They just had thousands of copies. You could just get it. And every issue of that magazine is the same. Israel's bad for American imperialism. That's their argument. Well, I think the American imperialists think otherwise. They think Israel's pretty good for them. Joe Biden has said that if Israel didn't exist, it would be necessary to create one. But that magazine's paid for by Saudi Arabia. And that all over the Middle East, you have these governments that are not revolutionary anti-imperialist governments like Iran or Syria. They're just, vassals of the United States. They sell America oil and they buy huge amounts of weapons from America, but their people are Muslims and they have to present themselves as being somehow on the side of the Palestinians. So they dump huge amounts of money into pro-Palestine activism, right? They just dump a huge amount of their money into that. But they don't really want it to be successful, because if it was successful, that would hurt their relationship with America, right? If there was like a really successful pro-Palestine movement happening here in the United States, that would cause the Americans to not be happy with them funding it. So they actually just dump a lot of money into very, very ineffective pro-Palestine stuff. Chest beating, I would argue, right?
And or blocking traffic, which we were talking about this week with Peter Coffin of CPI, made that great video about why the hell are you blocking traffic? You're only hurting the working class. This isn't going to win hearts and minds to your cause, guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, I talk about pally grifting to some degree or other, because
there's a lot of that going on.
I mean, if you will say you're pro-Palestine and there's no danger that anything you do is really going to have an impact over here, you can get some money in your bank account. You know what I'm saying?
How's it going, Jackson Hinkle? How's it going?
And I also think that, and this is interesting, I also think that that a lot of the anti-Semitism on the internet is coming from similar sources.
I do too.
That it's coming from Arab countries, not from Iran, not from Syria, not from the Houthis, but from Qatar and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, because anti-Semitism is a way that one can be anti-Israel and pro-American. The problem is just the Jews. It's not American imperialism.
That's right. That's the messaging anyway.
It wasn't just for those Jews, the Jewish lobby that secretly controls everything, blah, blah. That narrative, David Duke has made his career since he left Congress. He goes around the world to Ukraine. That's where he got his degree. Did you know that? David Duke is Dr. David Duke because the Ukrainians gave him a degree.
I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. And David Duke, he spends most of his life outside the United States, going around to Eastern Europe and going around the Middle East with his hand out. And I'm a former member of Congress, and I'll tell the Americans how bad the Jews are. Give me money,
And they do. They're happy to just throw money at
No one's ever going to listen to David Duke because he's David Duke. He's the Ku Klux Klan guy, so there's no danger. There's no risk for an Arab sultan or sheikh to give David Duke money because no one's ever going to listen to him, right?
But they listen to Jackson Hinkle, and they listen to Scott Ritter. And Scott Ritter is certainly not an anti-Semite. But, you've got Scott out there singing the gospel of Hamas. And I love Scott, but I disagree with him on this one. I can't support Hamas. I cannot bring myself to support an organization that did what they did on October 7th. I do not consider that legitimate resistance. And of course, the fallout is what really troubles me, because I'm not a Jew, but I do support the Jewish people. I don't support the Israeli government. I'm not a fan of Netanyahu. I think that it's fine to criticize the Israeli government and not be anti-Semitic. But we both have to admit, I think we can agree, that there's been a tremendous explosion of real hatred for Jewish people, targeting, harassing, actual violence against Jews since October 7th. And then, of course, like you just said, there are a lot of people out there hearing this propaganda, glomming on to the message, including members of our listening audience who tend to be more to the right or the libertarian side of the spectrum. But, they know that something's wrong in the world. They know that our leaders, our elites, are corrupt. And for years, they've been trying to put their finger on who to blame for all of our troubles. And thanks to October 7th and a lot of the associated propaganda that they see on the internet, they go, it's the Jews. I knew it all along. It's the Jews. Let's go get them, everybody. They've just been waiting to find out, who does the mob go kill? And as a student of history, that really troubles me, Caleb. It really troubles me, because we saw this happen a century ago and we know how it ended. And the result was the creation of Israel. And so here we are.
About what you're saying, because I agree with you to some extent, right? Anti-Semitism is socialism for fools.
There you go.
That's August Babel. It's a very famous quote, right? And that there are some people that just can't wrap their minds around class struggle and exploitation and imperialism, and they can only think in terms of my race, my tribe versus this other tribe, right? And it's a very primitive, idiotic form of thinking. And I have read a lot of anti-Semitic literature, and every anti-Semitic book I have ever read always starts with anti-communism. Communism is the most evil thing that ever blah, 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 blah. Just very easily
They go
debunked.
hand in hand.
Very easily debunked anti-communism. And then chapter 2 is all about how communism is a Jewish plot. And then from there, and that anti-Semitism.
Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's making a comeback.
Well, and that book too, right? That book, I people ask me about it. And I always tell them, like, have you actually read it? Because, step one in the secret Jewish conspiracy to take over the world is give everyone the right to vote. To not have the right to vote. It's a defense of feudalism. That book is basically saying getting rid of feudalism was a big conspiracy by the Jews. Well, I think getting rid of feudalism was a great thing. And if many Jews were involved in that process, good for them. You know what I mean?
Right.
And if you read that book, first of all, the premise that there's one great Jewish secret council that controls everything, that's absurd, right?
It is absurd. And it's absurd when people say that the Jews run the United States, Take a look at what's happening. Take a look at history, but take a look at what's happening right now and try to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. You don't have to love Israel, but let's try to look at it from their point of view. Right now, they're trying to wage war against a terrorist group that attacked their country on October the 7th. Now, our United States, yes, on paper, we support them. We send them money. We send them some weaponry, but not much. It's a very small portion of our defense spending every year compared to what we just gave Ukraine over the last 2 years. What we give to Israel is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. And you see our president and our Secretary of State, who literally said this week, you can't defeat Hamas, guys. Just forget about it. Israel, you need to pull back on your war. It's not a good optic. It's an election year. It's causing domestic political problems for the president. We'd really appreciate it. And they're just tugging on the leash. I argue that it's the other way around. The United States controls Israel. not Israel controlling the United States. We're always dragging them around by the leash and telling them what they can and cannot do. And we're trying to tell them that they can't beat Hamas. And when I saw Blinken say that this week, it really set me off, because I said, could you imagine if FDR's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, had said in 1941, guys, we're not going to be able to beat the Nazis. We need to just stay out of this whole thing. Let's just let that one go.
They're not comparable in any conceivable way. I mean,
that's how I see it.
I mean, you equate Gaza with Germany, a major military power with, a tiny tract of land that's like an open air prison where the people are just, you equate the two. I mean, I'm
talking about Hamas. I'm not talking about the people of Gaza.
Gaza is the area that Hamas controls. And it's like, I can't compare that to the German Empire, German imperialism, Fortress Europe, the Wehrmacht. I mean, that you just can't compare the two. I mean, people with hang gliders versus, the Germans, the German military in World War II, I just don't see the comparison.
Well, they probably wouldn't be getting bombed into rubble had they not started a war.
Well, I mean, at this point, the body count is at least 23,000 have died.
Those are Hamas's numbers. Can we really trust them?
I believe that's I mean, there's all kinds of international, people on the ground there. I mean, these are,
I'm not saying that civilians haven't been killed. I'm just saying I think those numbers might be inflated.
Well, I mean,
all governments do that in wartime,
All Gaza is. I mean, and if a country with a huge military started bombing an area, I'm surprised it's not more than that. Honestly.
Were they provoked, though? I mean, did they just kind of go in and bomb them for no reason, or are we forgetting about October 7th?
Well, that October 7th was a result of a people that have lived under occupation since 1948. I mean, and
don't you think there might be other ways to get their two-state solution if that's in fact what they want?
March. Remember the peaceful march that they had? The Israelis opened fire on it. And
I do remember that.
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing situation, and obviously, I sympathize with any of the victims on October 7th. Obviously, it's a horrendous thing that happened, but I mean, it's the result of a conflict that's been ongoing. Do
you think that Hamas should remain in power in Gaza?
I think the people of Gaza voted for Hamas because they see Hamas as the party that does not want to sell them out to Israel, and they see Fatah as having done that, as having sold them out. But
don't they understand that it is the government of Hamas who has taken all of these billions of dollars in humanitarian aid for their top leadership who are living the high life and, the hell away from Palestine? They're not setting foot in Gaza. They're living the good life, staying safe. But they couldn't even manage with all those billions, Caleb, to build bomb shelters for their people. And so they knew when they started that war on October 7th that Israel was going to retaliate. And they knew they were going to get bombed, and they knew civilians were going to die, but they couldn't be bothered to at least do the basics for their people. They are responsible for the safety of their civilians, and they didn't even build bomb shelters. It doesn't make any sense.
How can they be responsible for the safety of their civilians when they're living under complete occupation? And
But Israel's been out of there since 2005. They haven't been occupying Gaza in many, many years.
Saying that the war started on October 7th. I mean, this has been going on for how long this has been going on, and how many atrocities and how much daily humiliation, how many Palestinians are killed on a daily basis. This is, October 7th was absolutely horrendous, but it's not where the story starts. I know that. Yeah. I mean, that would be like saying that World War II started with Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right. Or with Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. I mean, you and I don't agree on that, and that's okay.
That's okay, though. That's why I love talking to you, because there's so much that we do agree on, and that's the beauty of Strange Bedfellows is, we come from opposing ideologies. We might take different sides on some issues, but on the big stuff, we both want peace. We both don't want to see this war escalate, and I believe that you don't want death to America.
Well, I'll tell you this. People ask me a lot, right? Like, do you support Israel's right to exist? And I actually don't know how to answer that question at this point. I used to unequivocally just say no. But I'm at the point where it's like, you know, I can say no, and I can say Israel is an illegitimate settler country. I don't believe you should have a country for one race. I believe that a government, you know, in a country should represent all the people there. But like, that's an ideological answer. That doesn't get us any closer to peace when I say that. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's right, because where would Israel go?
Right. How is life going to get better for the people of Palestine? How are the Palestinians going to not be in the situation they're going to be in? And the answer that I'm going to give is not a quick fix. Right. And it's not a satisfying answer. Right. You know, the answer that I used to give, I would just say, oh, you know, the Palestinians have got to win, free Palestine. It's like, I feel that way, but that's not an answer. OK, The answer is that Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela and the BRICS countries have to get stronger. And American imperialism and the global financial system centered around Wall Street and London has to get weaker. And as the BRICS countries and as the world becomes more multipolar, Israel will realize that they're going to have to improve the situation of the Palestinians if they want to, you know, be part of this rising global economy. And, you know, and gradually things are going to improve. And the hope for the Palestinians is for Russia and China and Venezuela and all the countries that are broken out of the Western system, you know, to get stronger, and for American imperialism to get weaker. And that's not a quick fix. That's not going to happen tomorrow, right? This is probably decades in the works, but that's the future. And, you know, at one point before Menachem Begin was elected, the Soviet Union had a plan to team up with Iraq, to team up with a lot of the Arab countries in Syria. And they were going to bring industrialization to the whole Middle East. And they were going to build power plants and electrification, and Israel was going to be tied in with the Arab countries economically, and they were going to industrially develop that region. They were going to build irrigation systems and green the desert. And the Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein, you know, sponsored big conferences about how we can industrialize the Middle East and not have it just be the world's oil plantation, which is what the Middle East is right now. I mean, they pump oil out of the ground. There's oil and sand in many of these countries. But, you know, do what Gaddafi did in Libya, green the desert, right? Make it economically prosperous, and have the peoples of that region start trading with each other. And that's a realistic road to peace, right? And that's what China advocates with their Belt and Road Initiative. China has relations with Israel. They're much more critical of Israel than they've been before at this point. But, you know, the road to peace is when people start trading with each other, when people have jobs, when people have economic opportunities. You know, people tend to treat each other better, and, you know, violence is not what they turn to. And you know, I mean, that's the road to a better world. And again, that's not a quick fix, and that doesn't get people's anger out. People are angry at what Israel's doing, and they want me to say, oh, the road to peace is Israel being destroyed. Well, again, I can say that, but that's not going to happen, okay? You know
it's just not going to happen. It's not realistic.
So, you know, and that might get your anger out, but I'm talking about, like, what can we actually do here? And there is a long-term realistic solution, which Russia and China are the key to. And that's how I see it, you know? I believe that people, the Palestinians, I view them as an occupied people. I believe they have the right to defend themselves. But that said, you know, I'm more interested in talking realistically than I am in getting my emotions out. I was doing that my whole 20s. I was getting my emotions out. I was getting arrested.
Me too.
But I'm tired of that, because I want things to really get better. That's what I want. And,
that's right.
And they don't get better with catharsis. So there you go.
That's right. There has to be mutual coexistence.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.